Meredith Calloway was tightening the fuel line fitting on the left side of the engine block when the phone rang the first time. She didn't answer it. She was 3 feet into the engine bay of a 1978 Kenworth W900, lying across the frame rail on a piece of old moving blanket she'd folded twice for her hip, and the fitting had been weeping diesel for 2 days, and she was done letting it weep. The shop smelled the way it always smelled, old oil and concrete dust and the particular dry sweetness of a diesel engine that has been run hard and cooled slowly over many years. And the phone rang again, and she still didn't answer it. She had a 3/8 wrench in her right hand and her left hand flat against the block, the way you put your hand on something you know, and she was listening. Not to the phone, to the engine, to whether the fitting was seated or whether it was going to keep talking back. She was 58 years old. She had been in this shop, one version or another of this shop, for 31 years. The ring on her left hand was plain gold, worn thin at the bottom, and her hands were the hands of someone who had torqued fittings and bled fuel lines and rebuilt injectors in cold weather without complaint since the year her oldest daughter was born. The shop itself sat on 42 acres of bottomland in Harlan County, Kentucky, which she and her husband Raymond had owned outright since 1997, paid off early in a good soybean year, and which she had not once considered selling in the 14 months since Raymond died. The phone rang a third time. She answered it. It was her daughter, Joanna, calling from Lexington, asking if she was still planning to drive at the Harlan County Memorial Pull in 6 weeks, and Meredith said yes, and Joanna was quiet for a moment. And then Joanna said she didn't think that was a good idea, and Meredith said she appreciated the concern, and then she put the phone down on the frame rail and went back to the fitting. I want to tell you what that fitting represented. I want to tell you what it meant that she was in that shop at all, because the pull itself, the state invitational memorial class at the Harlan County Fairgrounds, which Raymond Calloway had competed in for 19 consecutive years without missing a single one, that pull was 6 weeks away, and Meredith had not told anyone except Joanna that she was going to drive it. She had not told the organizers. She had not told the neighbors. She had not told Raymond's best friend, Dale Simmons, who had helped Raymond build the W900 over a period of 4 years, and who had been coming by every Sunday since the funeral to check on the engine and check on Meredith, in that order, which was exactly the order Meredith preferred. She had not told anyone because she was not sure yet that she could do it. She was not sure the truck was ready. She was not sure she was ready, and she had learned from 31 years of marriage to Raymond Calloway that you do not say a thing out loud until you know whether it is true. Now I need to stop and tell you about Raymond, because without Raymond, none of this is a story. It is just a woman lying across a frame rail in a county shop in eastern Kentucky, and that is worth something on its own. But it is not the whole thing. Raymond Calloway had been a long-haul driver for 17 years before his back gave out, and when it gave out, he came home and started working on things in the shop the way some men start drinking, methodically, with clear purpose, without apology. He was not a man who talked about what he was going to do. He was a man who did things, and then, when they were done, showed you. He had bought the 1978 Kenworth W900 in 2004 from an estate sale in Harlan County, paid $4,200 for it, drove it home on a temporary tag, and parked it in the shop. Meredith had asked him what he intended to do with it. He said he wasn't sure yet. That was a Tuesday in October. By the following Sunday, he had the engine out. The engine was a Cummins NTC 855, a big cam for those of you who know what that means, and I'll explain it for those who don't, because this is the part that matters. The NTC 855 was Cummins' flagship heavy-duty engine through the 1970s and into the early 1980s. A 14-liter inline six-cylinder that produced somewhere between 300 and 450 horsepower depending on configuration, but whose real character lived not in its horsepower but in its torque. At peak, this engine produced over 1,200 pound-feet of torque. At low RPM, at the bottom of its power band, at the kind of speeds where most modern performance engines are barely awake, this engine was pulling with everything it had. I need you to understand something about torque and horsepower because it is the intellectual key to everything that happened at the Harlan County Fairgrounds that September. Horsepower is what an engine does at high RPM. It is the number on the brochure, the number that sounds impressive, the number that wins arguments at gas stations. Torque is what an engine does against resistance. It is the number that moves things that do not want to move. In a truck pull, the sled gets heavier as it goes down the track. The weight box shifts forward, increasing the load on the rear of the sled, increasing the resistance the truck must overcome. At maximum load, you do not need an engine that spins fast. You need an engine that pushes hard at low speed, that does not give up when the load gets impossible, that has the kind of deep and patient strength that does not announce itself. Raymond understood this. He had understood it for 20 years before he bought the Kenworth, from driving loaded freight over mountain grades in the dark, from learning what an engine sounds like when it is working and what it sounds like when it is about to quit. He did not talk about it in these terms. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, in short sentences that assumed you already knew the first part. He rebuilt the NTC 855 over the winter of 2004 and 2005. He bored the cylinders. He rebuilt the fuel system with a PTG governor that he had sourced from a retired Cummins field rep in Corbin, Kentucky, a man named Elwood Tate, who had been setting fuel systems since 1971, and who came out to the shop twice and sat on a 5-gallon bucket and watched Raymond work and said once that Raymond had good hands. That was the highest compliment Elwood Tate gave to anyone. Meredith brought them both coffee and did not say anything, and Raymond did not introduce her, and Elwood Tate nodded at her in a way that meant he understood she already knew everything he was there to say. Raymond pulled his first truck pull in the W900 in the fall of 2005. He finished third. He came home, ate dinner, and went back to the shop. He pulled again in the spring of 2006 and finished second. He came home, ate dinner, and went back to the shop. In 2007, he won the Harlan County Memorial Class for the first time, and when he came home, Meredith had a piece of chocolate cake waiting on the workbench, which was her version of a celebration, and Raymond ate it standing up and then put his hand on the fender of the Kenworth and stood there for a moment, the way you stand next to something that has done what you asked of it. He won it again in 2009, and 2011, and 2014, and 2016, and then in 2019 his back got bad again, the kind of bad that meant a surgery, and he missed that year, and in 2020 the pull was canceled, and in 2021 he was back in the truck and finished second to a sponsored rig out of Pulaski County with a built Caterpillar 3406B and a crew of 4 men in matching shirts. Raymond shook the crew chief's hand afterward and came home and ate dinner and went back to the shop. In 2022, he won again. In 2023, he was diagnosed with the cancer that had been in him. The doctors said, for probably 2 years without anyone knowing. He died on a Wednesday in March of 2024 at home in the bedroom that looked out over the shop. Meredith was holding his hand. His last coherent conversation, 3 days before, had been about the fuel injection timing on the NTC 855, which he thought was 3 degrees advanced from where he wanted it, and whether Meredith had the tools to correct it herself or whether she should call Dale. She told him she had the tools. He said he knew she did. He said it the way he said most things, as if it were a fact that had been established long ago and required no further discussion. Now, let me tell you what was happening in the other timeline. Let me tell you what was happening at the Harlan County Fairgrounds in the days before the September pull, because that story runs alongside Meredith's story in the shop, and they run together until they don't. The State Invitational Memorial Class drew 22 trucks that year. 14 of them were local, county, and regional rigs, some of them pulling for the first time, some of them veterans of the circuit. 8 of them were not local. The most prominent of the 8 was a 2021 Peterbilt 389 running a fully built Caterpillar C15 Acert entered by a team out of Bowling Green called Ironworks Motorsports. The crew chief was a man named Travis Hollis, 43 years old, who had been running pull-in rigs professionally for 11 years, and who arrived at the Harlan County Fairgrounds on a Friday afternoon with a 40-foot enclosed trailer, a generator, a full parts inventory, and 3 crew members. The Peterbilt was painted in Ironworks Motorsports colors, deep red with chrome lettering, and the C-15 had been built to produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 horsepower by a shop in Nashville that specialized in nothing else. The rig had competed in 14 events that season. It had won 9 of them. Travis Hollis walked the track on Friday evening, checking the clay, checking the moisture, checking the distance markers, the way a professional does. He was thorough, and he was good at his job. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 11 years in a world where the money and the equipment were the argument, where a bigger budget produced a better result often enough that the exceptions did not change the rule. He looked at the entry list. He saw the 1978 Kenworth W900, registered in the name of Meredith Calloway, Harlan County. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went back to his trailer, back in the shop on that same Friday evening. 6 weeks earlier in the story I'm telling you, Meredith was lying on her back under the W900 with a work light clipped to the frame, looking at the underside of the engine the way Raymond used to look at it, which was slowly and without rushing, the way you read a letter from someone you loved. She had the fuel injection timing corrected. She had the fitting sealed. She had gone through the injectors one by one, the way Raymond had taught her, not shown her, taught her, over the course of 3 winters, sitting on opposite sides of the engine with their hands in the same spaces, him explaining once and expecting her to remember, which she always did. What she had not told anyone was that she had also changed the turbocharger. Raymond had been running a rebuilt original turbo for years, and it was adequate. And adequate had been enough for Raymond because Raymond's hands on the controls were the real advantage, and he knew it. But Meredith had found, in Raymond's own notebook, a spiral-bound 5-subject notebook with his handwriting in it, the handwriting of a man who had never been asked to write neatly and had developed his own system. A note from 2021 about a whole-set HX 55 turbocharger that Raymond had considered and not installed. The note said, "More air at the bottom. Better fill at low RPM would suit the engine. Didn't want to change what was working." Below that, in the same pen, a single line. Meredith would do it. She had read that line 4 times. Then she had ordered the turbocharger. She installed it herself over 2 weekends in July, with Dale Simmons standing nearby on the second weekend, not helping, just present the way a good neighbor is present, handing her the correct wrench before she asked for it, refilling her coffee without being asked, saying nothing about Raymond except once, at the end of the second day, when the engine turned over and the turbo spooled and the shop filled with the sound of the NTC 855 running right, and Dale put his hand on the door frame and looked at the floor for a moment, and Meredith let him do that. And then she revved the engine twice and let it settle and said, "That's where he wanted it." And Dale said, "Yeah." And that was all either of them said about it. Now, the day of the pull. It was a Saturday in September, the kind of September morning in eastern Kentucky that comes in cool and goes out warm. The sky, the particular blue that happens after a week of rain, has cleared. The fairgrounds clay still dark from the moisture, but packed hard from the sun of the previous 2 days. Meredith arrived at 6:15 in the morning. She drove the Kenworth herself, on a lowboy trailer behind her pickup, which was a 2003 Ford F350 with 211,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield she'd been meaning to fix since April. She backed the Kenworth off the trailer in the staging area with the kind of precision that comes from having watched someone do something 1,000 times and then having done it yourself. She did not need a spotter. She was wearing Raymond's old work jacket. It was a Carhartt, brown, with a small tear in the left elbow that Raymond had never repaired because he said the tear didn't affect the function. His name was not on it. She had not put her name on it either. She wore it because it was warm and because it smelled, still, faintly, of the shop. Travis Hollis saw the Kenworth come off the trailer. He was standing near the ironworks rig with a coffee and a clipboard, and he watched the W900 come down the ramps, and he watched Meredith step out of the pickup, and he said something to one of his crew members that I will not repeat here because it is not worth repeating, and the crew member laughed, and Travis Hollis did not correct the laugh. There were people at the Harlan County Fairgrounds who knew Raymond Calloway. There were people who had watched him pull for 19 years, who had stood at the rail and watched the W900 come off the line in that particular way it had, without drama, without tire spin, just steady forward motion under load, and who had driven to the fairgrounds that morning, knowing that Raymond was gone and not knowing who was going to drive his truck, and who saw Meredith step out of the pickup in Raymond's jacket and understood immediately what was happening and felt something in their chests that was not a small thing. Dale Simmons was in the 4th row of the grandstands, in the same seat he had sat in for 19 years when Raymond pulled. He had a thermos of coffee. He had not told Meredith he was coming. He had been there since 7 in the morning. Joanna Calloway had driven down from Lexington. She stood at the fence line near the start, where Meredith could not see her from the cab. She had not told her mother she was coming either. The pull began at 10 in the morning. The memorial class was the 4th class of the day. Meredith spent the first 3 classes in the staging area, checking things that did not need to be checked, tightening things that did not need to be tightened, doing the work of someone who needs their hands to be busy, because their hands are the part of them that knows how to be calm. Travis Hollis pulled third in the class. The ironworks Peterbilt came to the line with the precision of a well-funded operation, and the C-15 lit up with a sound that was genuinely impressive. A high, hard bark of power that the crowd responded to the way crowds respond to things that are loud and expensive and clearly capable. The truck launched clean, the tires biting the clay, and it moved down the track with authority. The sled came up. The load increased. At 250 feet, the Peterbilt was still moving. At 280 feet, it slowed. At 311 feet, it stopped. The crowd gave it what it deserved, which was a real and honest ovation for a pull that was genuinely good, and Travis Hollis drove back to staging with 311 feet, marked on the board. 311 feet. That was the number. Meredith was the seventh driver in the class. She heard the 311 feet announced over the PA. She was standing next to the Kenworth with her hand flat on the hood, not looking at the track, looking at the engine bay. She had the hood up. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was doing what Raymond used to do before a pull, which was listen, not to anything anyone was saying, to the engine, to whether it was ready. She closed the hood. She put on her helmet, which was Raymond's helmet, which fit her because Raymond had a small head for a large man, and she had a large head for a woman of her size, and these things had always made them compatible in ways that went beyond helmets. She climbed into the cab. I want you to understand what the cab of a 1978 Kenworth W900 smells like after 20 years of competition use. It smells like diesel and rubber and the particular human smell of someone who has sat in that seat for 19 years of pulls and 10,000 miles of test runs and one long drive home from a surgery in Lexington when Raymond's back was bad and he couldn't drive himself. It smells like Raymond. Meredith sat in that seat and put her hands on the wheel and did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to, and because what she needed to say had already been said in the shop on 2 weekends in July, and in the notebook she had read 4 times, and in the fitting she had tightened until it stopped weeping, and in every cold morning she had started the engine just to run it, and every evening she had covered it with the same canvas tarp Raymond had used since 2007. She drove to the line. The crowd at the Harlan County Fairgrounds was not a small crowd. There were perhaps 800 people in the grandstands and along the fence line, and a significant number of them knew who Meredith Calloway was, and a significant number of them knew what they were watching, and a significant number of them were very quiet as the 1978 Kenworth W900 came to the line. The announcer said her name. He said it carefully, the way you say the name of someone you are honoring. He said Raymond's name, too. He said that Raymond Calloway had pulled at Harlan County for 19 years, and that this pull was dedicated to his memory, and the grandstands were quiet in a way that 800 people being quiet is its own kind of sound. The hookup man set the chain. Meredith watched him in the mirror. The chain went taut with the short metallic note it always makes, the note that means the slack is gone and everything from this point forward is real, and she put the truck in gear and she let the clutch out. The NTC 855 did not make a dramatic sound coming off the line. It did not bark or roar. It came into its power the way Raymond always said it did, the way a draft horse leans into a collar, with its whole weight, with everything it had, without announcing what it was doing. The tires pressed into the clay. They did not spin. They found the ground, and they kept it. At 50 feet, the truck was moving at a walking pace, and the crowd was still quiet. At 100 feet, the sled was loading up and the engine note was deepening. not rising, dropping into the lower registers where the torque lives, where the NTC 855 had always lived. The turbo was spooling in a way that was different from before. Fuller, earlier, the way Raymond's notebook had said it would be. More air at the bottom, better fill at low RPM, and Meredith could feel it in the seat, in the wheel, in the way the truck was not fighting the load but absorbing it, the way a good animal absorbs a hard pull. At 150 feet, the crowd began to understand that something was happening. At 200 feet, there were people standing. At 250 feet, Meredith passed the point where she had watched Raymond stop in bad years, the years when the engine wasn't right, or the clay was too dry, or the timing was off, and she did not think about those years. She thought about the fitting. She thought about the notebook. She thought about Dale's hand on the doorframe. At 280 feet, the load on the sled was at its maximum and the Kenworth was still moving. Not fast, not dramatically, moving the way a thing moves when it is doing exactly what it was built to do, when every decision made over 20 years of rebuilding and racing and learning and losing and winning and losing again has added up to this particular moment on this particular track with this particular load, moving the way Raymond used to say the engine moved when he had it right, like it doesn't know how to quit. At 311 feet, Meredith Calloway passed Travis Hollis's mark. The grandstands at the Harlan County Fairgrounds made a sound that I do not have adequate words for. It was not a roar exactly, though it was loud. It was the sound of 800 people releasing something they had been holding, something that was grief and recognition and the particular emotion that lives at the intersection of those two things. The feeling that something has been finished that needed to be finished, that something has been honored that deserved to be honored. Dale Simmons in the fourth row did not stand up. He sat with his thermos on his knee and his eyes on the truck and his jaw set in the way of a man who is not going to cry in public and is working at it. Joanna Calloway at the fence line was not working at it. The truck went to 334 feet before the engine note changed. Not failed, changed, the load finally exceeding what the sled had left to give, and Meredith eased off and let it settle, and sat in the cab for a moment before she drove back to staging. She did not raise her hands. She did not honk the horn. She drove back the way Raymond always drove back, which was at the same pace she had come in without theater. She climbed down from the cab. She took off the helmet. She put her hand flat on the fender of the Kenworth, the way she always had, the way Raymond always had, and she stood there for a moment. Travis Hollis came across the staging area. He walked the whole distance without stopping, which meant he had decided to do it before he started, and he stopped in front of her and looked at the truck for a moment before he looked at her. He said, "That's a Cummins big cam." It was not a question. She said yes. He said, "What turbo?" She told him. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating something. He said, "Your husband build it?" She said, "We built it." He put his hand out and she shook it, and he walked back to his trailer without another word, and that was the right amount of words for what had just happened. The pull result stood. Meredith Calloway won the Harlan County Memorial Class with a pull of 334 feet in a 1978 Kenworth W900 powered by a Cummins NTC 855 big cam engine, rebuilt by hand over 20 years, fitted with a whole set HX55 turbocharger installed by its current driver in 2 weekends in July, from a note in her dead husband's spiral notebook. Dale Simmons found her in the staging area 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the engine, which she had the hood up on again, because she was already checking the turbo outlet temperature and the fuel fitting and the things that needed to be checked. He handed her a coffee from his thermos. She took it. After a while, he said, "He knew you'd do it." She said, "I know he did." That was all. Joanna found her later, near the trailer, and hugged her for a long time, and Meredith let her. And when Joanna stepped back, her eyes were red and Meredith's were dry, which was not because Meredith had not been moved, but because Meredith had already done her crying. In the shop, in July, on the second Sunday when the engine turned over and the turbo spooled and the shop filled with the sound of something Raymond had wanted and she had given him, 6 months too late and right on time. The 1978 Kenworth W900 is still in the shop on the 42 acres in Harlan County. Meredith starts it every 2 weeks, lets it run to temperature, checks the fitting, checks the turbo, covers it with the canvas tarp. The spiral notebook is on the workbench, held open with a 1/2-inch socket. She has not entered another pull. She has not said she won't. Raymond's jacket hangs on the hook by the shop door. She wears it when the mornings are cold. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be bought or certified or installed by a professional crew in matching shirts. It lives in the hands of people who learned it slowly, in cold shops from someone who expected them to remember, and it waits there, patient and quiet, for the moment when it is needed. The ground at Harlan County measured 334 feet of it on a Saturday in September. The dirt didn't know whose hands had built the engine. It just told the truth about what the engine was. If you know a story like this one, a person who did the quiet work, who learned from someone they lost, who showed up anyway, put it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that without qualification because the stories you leave there are the reason this channel exists. There are people in your life and in your community whose names will not appear on a leaderboard or a trophy or a sponsored team jacket, and the only way those names survive is if someone who knew them takes the time to say so. This is a place for that. Every week on this channel, there is another story about someone who did the work before anyone was watching, who built something in the dark, who understood something deeply enough that it could not be taken from them. If that is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe, because there are more of them, and they deserve to be told with the care they were earned with. And if this one moved you, if you watched Meredith Calloway drive that truck down a track in her husband's jacket and felt something you didn't expect to feel, pass it on. Stories like this don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Raymond Calloway knew that. He wrote it in a notebook and left it on a workbench for the person who would know what to do with it. She did.